Donetsk collaborator and separatist Pavel Gubarev made a sharp statement against the Kremlin regime. He called on Russian servicemen not to surrender their weapons after the end of the war with Ukraine and openly accused Putin's government of betraying the interests of the Russian people. He published an appeal to the Russian military on his Telegram channel. Gubarev, who has long been at the epicenter of military actions against Ukraine and actively supports Russian aggression, made a grim statement for the Kremlin. He called on the Russian military not to disarm after the end of the war and declared his readiness to lead armed resistance against the Kremlin authorities. "We surrender our weapons. We surrender the country," Gubarev declared in his address to the servicemen. According to him, the Putin regime is the main enemy of the Russian people, and freezing the conflict with Ukraine will not solve Russia's internal problems. Gubarev directly accused the Kremlin authorities of deliberately destroying Russian statehood and causing damage that is incomparably greater than the actions of Ukraine and NATO. He emphasizes that while Russian soldiers are fighting at the front, the authorities are waging a war against their own people. These statements sound especially harsh against the backdrop of Yevgeny Prigozhin's recent rebellion, when the forces of the Wagner PMC almost began an armed confrontation with the Russian Defense Ministry. However, Gubarev goes even further, calling not just for a mutiny, but for a full-fledged organization of armed resistance after the end of military operations at the front. Political analysts have long pointed to growing tensions within the Russian military. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers accustomed to violence and armed methods of resolving conflicts could become a catalyst for an internal crisis if they find themselves in civilian life, with weapons and without support. After the war, veterans who were accustomed to high incomes at the front will face everyday difficulties and low wages in Russia. This will create grounds for discontent and protest, especially against the backdrop of growing social inequality and corruption in the government system. Gubarev directly points to the possibility of organizing an armed uprising of the Russian people as the only way to save Russia. In fact, he calls for the creation of armed detachments that will be able to resist the Kremlin authorities in the event of a political crisis. The recent conflict between the Wagner PMC and the Russian security forces showed that the internal struggle for power is becoming a real threat to the stability of Putin's regime. At that time, Yevgeny Prigozhin openly criticized the Ministry of Defense and practically prepared his troops for an uprising. Gubarev, unlike Prigozhin, goes even further. He accuses the entire Putin regime of betraying national interests and directly states the need for armed resistance after the end of the war. If such sentiments continue to gain strength among Russian military and nationalists, it could develop into a large-scale internal conflict, including civil war. The Kremlin no longer fully controls military formations, some of which are subordinate to unofficial leaders and field commanders. Political experts note that disarming veterans after the end of hostilities may encounter stiff resistance. The weapons that remain in the hands of former soldiers may be used against the Russian authorities themselves. Given the growing discontent among veterans and nationalists, such a development could lead to civil war. Putin's regime would face danger not only on the foreign front but also on the domestic front, especially if nationalist leaders join forces. A Russian woman criticized the policy of Russian President Vladimir Putin towards Ukraine, including the so-called special operation, asking a rhetorical question regarding the original Chinese lands that are now part of the Russian Federation. The woman quite reasonably noted that Russians who advocate for the SVO in Ukraine should not resist if official Beijing suddenly announces the beginning of a similar military operation on the territory of the Russian Federation to return the original Chinese lands. Does it mean that China is then obliged to conduct a military offensive in the Far East and return its historical lands? And then the Russians should not object because China has the right to restore historical justice? She emphasized. In addition, the Russian woman reminded the authorities of her country that when the Soviet Union collapsed and an independent Russian Federation and an independent Ukraine were formed, both sides signed the relevant documents and took on the obligation to respect each other's borders. Recall, China has a long historical memory of Far Eastern territories being seized by the Russians. In the mid-19th century, at the end of the Opium Wars, the weak Qing dynasty ceded 1.4 million square kilometers of land, including the whole area east of the Ussuri and northeast of the Amur River to the Pacific coast in what was then called Outer Manchuria and now constitutes much of Russia's Far East. This territory annexed to the Tsarist Empire in the Aigun 1858 and Beijing 1860 treaties was later absorbed by the Soviet Union. By some calculations, the total territory once under Chinese imperial sovereignty that passed to Russian control amounted to almost 6 million square kilometers. As early as 1919, when the outcome of the Russian Civil War was still in doubt, Lev Karakhan, the Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, made promises to China that the Soviet Union would return the Chinese people all that had been taken from them by the Tsarist Empire during the period of so-called unequal treaties. The Soviet government made clear that for this to happen, it would be necessary, first of all, to put an end to the invasion of Manchuria and Siberia by brigands. A few months later, with Soviet forces victorious in the Civil War and less in need of help from China, Karakhan's offer was withdrawn, but not forgotten in Beijing. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has claimed to be its legal successor. By this logic, from China's point of view, Moscow would be responsible for fulfilling unkept Soviet promises to return Russian Far East territories. And since taking power in 1999, President Vladimir Putin has made a series of gestures toward settling these disputes. According to recent Chinese official statements, under his leadership, Russia has on 4 separate occasions returned a total of 173 square kilometers of territory to Chinese sovereignty. Of course, compared to the larger claim of nearly 6 million square kilometers of occupied territory mentioned above, this is only a drop in the ocean.